Our guest today is Mr. Martin Sobotnik, who is Associate Dean of the California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, California. He's also a composer and visiting FAU for a few days of concerts and lectures. And with Mr. Sobotnik, we have Dr. Gene Crabb, who is the chairman of the music department at FAU, Mr. Bill Prince, a jazz musician, composer, and Mr. Tom Walters, who teaches public school music in Lee County, Fort Myers. You don't mind me calling you Morton, do you?
No.
Morton, give us some idea of your background. I don't want to tell people what you do. I think maybe you can do it better, and we can hear it from you. What is your how did you get into this particular area of music that you're in now? That's a big question.
Yeah. Well, I started out as a musician in the normal sense of the word. I played clarinet and started composing very young in life, and studying a lot. So that by the time I was in high school, I was already writing a considerable amount of music and was pretty much up with the most recent innovations that were happening at that time. So by 1951, I was in a kind of Webern, post-Webern period, and the beginnings of electronic music were in the early 50s in Germany, and I was aware of those and began within a year or so after the first studios began experimenting with electronic music, mostly in the theater, because I was writing a lot of theater music at the time, and developed some rather strong views and visions at that time about what I was going to be doing, and electronic music became very important in that, and so it was just part of the
natural
evolution. Yeah.
Dr. Crabb, you had some questions you were mentioning about orchestra music.
Yes, since I work with the orchestra here, we were interested in experimenting in some of the new music, and Mr. Sobotnik has had some successful pieces that he has composed for the orchestra, and we had two pieces of laminations and one called Play Number 2, which we ordered on a rental basis to have for this workshop session. And of course I'm interested in Mr. Sobotnik's point of view in preparing pieces of this type, what his attitude is toward them in terms of his total compositional output and his interest for the future.
Well, I see, for myself anyway, I see that more or less two kinds of music that I have been, in fact those two pieces represent those two kinds that I have been writing for the orchestra and will continue to write. One is a recording piece, a piece which is really intended, though it can be performed live with no difficulty, it really is intended for to be recorded and heard by people in their homes, and maybe whatever live performance is fine. The other is very specifically for concert performances, which Play 2 represents. And the new piece that I have a new commission which I'll be working on this summer, which is for a live electronic group, orchestra, and lights, visuals of some sort, which I haven't decided yet what they are. But this is a concert piece which couldn't be done any other way. The involvement with the orchestra and the preparation and the problems of preparation are sizable, because with the one kind, the recording piece, the problems are relatively normal, maybe extraordinary in certain cases, but relatively speaking, you're asking them to play their instruments. You maybe ask them to make certain sounds that they weren't used to making, or coordinating in a way they weren't used to coordinating. But nevertheless, the end result is entirely through the ear, and that's what they're used to dealing with. And that kind of piece does not cause major problems. I think we experienced that with these two pieces. It was easier to put together a section of lamination than it was Play 2. Play 2 and the new piece will involve I can't leave a dead spot on the stage. I mean, I can't have the conductor being the only theatrical person on the stage in a normal concert situation, so that the orchestra members become part of an entire ritual which takes place on the stage. And from beginning to end, it has to have some eye quality as well as sound quality. And this is difficult for an orchestra. It's a little bit like when we were kids and we'd hide from someone by putting our hands over our face. The orchestra members are used to hiding behind the conductor. They're always seen, but they pretend like they're not seen. They talk to their neighbors. They do all kinds of things as if no one's watching them at all, because the focus is supposed to be on the conductor. And for them to realize that the focus is on them, for them to do these other kinds of gestures, I think makes them very uncomfortable. And I don't know what the answer is to that.
It's really a theatrical piece along with its musical content.
Yes, definitely.
I think that orchestral players oftentimes appear to resent the real attention that artists on the stage get in the theater field, and perhaps this isn't a chance for them to come forward and to experience a new thrill.
Yeah, one would think so, but it doesn't usually work that way.
Morton, have you been doing these pieces with young orchestras and old orchestras? And I'm kind of curious as to what the reaction is, the two age groups, how they respond to those unusual directions.
Well, my personal experience with the works is limited. I conducted the first performance of each of those works and a few other performances of them, but I'm not actually a conductor, so the pieces get played and I'm not even there half the time. I get recordings and so forth, so I don't go through the process, and I couldn't give you a blow-by-blow description. I would assume that when it gets performed, there's probably a pretty good reaction to it, and when it doesn't get performed, I never hear about it because there's been a bad reaction. My own experience with it has been that age is not really relevant totally to the reaction that seems to occur. Generally speaking, the younger orchestra members feel, this is very personal, and I don't really know whether this is true or not because I'm just guessing, but I suspect from the reactions I've watched that some of the older people in the orchestra are genuinely interested, and some of the younger people are genuinely interested, maybe more young than old. Most of the young people know they're supposed to be interested, and therefore tend to cause less trouble, but I'm not sure that they're
committed.
They're really as committed as they might be. I think that I don't think age is a real distinction here. I think it's a myth in this. I think, as a matter of fact, in some cases, some of the older people really surprise you, and one can understand it. They've gone through a lot of things, and they have very little to lose by trying something new. And their opinions are maybe formed, but they're not quite as challenged. Some of them. It depends on the person a whole lot.
Can I just explore that question just a little bit more and turn it around to make a comparison perhaps between American orchestras and European orchestras? I know you've had your works performed in Europe. Was there any difference there that you might have noticed?
I actually wasn't present. It was play 2, I think it was done in Warsaw, and lamination was done at Darmstadt. But I wasn't present. I only had reports, and the reports were just sort of neutral. There was no particular. My experience with the European musicians and the European orchestras is that they're like the young people I was talking about who know they're supposed to be involved. They're very professional, and they're used to doing a lot of crazy things, but they don't like it at all. They just do it, and no one. They don't put up. There is no such thing as going on strike. They're European orchestra. I mean, they don't just get up and walk out. They sit there and they do what they're supposed to do, and they generally don't fool around as they do in American orchestras. It's very difficult in American orchestras. If the orchestra decides, even big ones, that they're not going to do something, it's very hard to turn them around.
May I ask if you feel that possibly at times or people have told you that you maybe are way ahead of your time, or what? How have you felt about it? Your relationship to the listener's point of view. A lot of them, don't seem to be ready for this, and.
Well, I think that I don't think there is such a thing as being ahead of your time. I really don't believe that. I think that there are many simultaneous tracks that we go on. My experience is such that certain things mean certain things to me that they don't mean to other people. People with a more similar background or another background which lets them fit into that are able to deal with it. I'm very much right in the middle of my time, given what my background is, and given a certain audience's background. And years from now, I think the old myth, that when a guy's dead, then the music begins to be more usual. I don't even think it's ever been true. Bach was performed all the time in his lifetime, and they happened to pick him up in the 19th century again. But it wasn't until the 19th century we started picking anyone up from the past. They died and that was it. You just let them stay buried. I think it's a good idea.
Play his music while he's there.
Yeah, I think that there's within a matter. I think if I'm ahead, I may be ahead a year or two, or 3 years, or 4 years, or 5 years. Play two, which had a terrible time getting started in terms of a piece. This season is probably being performed close to 30 times somewhere in this country.
Of course, once it starts, then it kind of snowballs.
It snowballs, but I would imagine that it still has trouble every first time to any audience.
We seem to be implying that there's perhaps some preparation or conditioning that might influence both the audience and the orchestras that are playing this. With your background, both as an instrumentalist and as a composer, what kind of activities might you suggest, especially with youngsters, perhaps even your own youngster, things you've found that she's enjoyed, that might perhaps free them from the sort of traditional approach to learning music that we've had with notation and physical response? What kind of activities might you suggest?
Well, I think that with music we have the biggest problem of any of the arts, because the language of music requires, as we've known it, the language of music requires years of learning beyond. The child speaks very fluently by 4.5 years old or 5, and can draw, paint, and be very expressive in all kinds of ways. But aside from hitting a couple of tin cans, and aside from a few prodigies on instruments, the child does not have the ability to be able to play an instrument complexly enough to deal with complex musical ideas, whereas the child deals with actually very complex spatial ideas and design ideas that most of us somehow have lost as we've grown older. So my feeling about it is that if we could find, and there are means now, by which a young person, by that I mean 4.5, 5, 6 years old, in that very young age, the preschool and early school age, could deal with composing, with the creative act of putting sounds together, as they do with the easel on a paintbrush and colors, then I think it wouldn't make any difference later what they learn to do. I mean, they learn to play the piano or whatever they do. They will have had the initial creative experience, which if then the teacher is ready to help, the child can continue with in some way. But to start a child with piano lessons, for instance, and therefore you have to learn the scales, and you have to learn all these things. By the time you get around to writing a piece of music, you're bound to be writing, your ear is already, the reality of sound is in the past already. There's no way around it. And if it's not the past, it's some composer, because the child's got to read something. I think things like Suzuki method are, if they were applied, just ear work, if they were applied, could allow children possibly to deal with improvisational things and things. But I think the most important thing is to give them an easel a music easel to work with. And I think it can be done with maybe electronic means or some means by which they can just compose, put things together. And I don't think tin cans, hitting bottom of tin cans in rhythm is the answer to that. I think it's more complex.
Do you think we have been more, perhaps, definitive with young people and their music, rather than exploring general textures and sounds? Perhaps last night, as I watched the rehearsal, I thought about intonation and how relatively unimportant in a specific example, the aleatoric characteristics of a particular texture that you were attempting, that perhaps not being quite as specific with such things as exacting rhythms and intonation, that perhaps are playing with sound, all kinds of sound that we hear, perhaps having a child organize sounds in that he hears from nature, taping parts of these and putting them together in things that are pleasing to him.
Yeah, that would be one way. There's a very complicated problem involved in all of this, which is that there are always philosophic implications in any decision which is made which limits the field. Like if you say intonation is not important and go in another direction and say that the child doesn't need, if the child doesn't develop intonation, will do things without that, then the child's experience toward things, for instance, what if the child were to develop an idea, which is possible, that everybody will play the same note, which is a very possible, logical thing for a child to come up with. Without intonation, they can't do that. What if the child's to come up with, which is also a possibility, a steady rhythmic beat? Very likely thing for a child to come up with. If they don't have a sense of rhythm, they can't deal with that. So you can't throw it in one direction or another. I think the answer is to get that same flexibility that you have with a paintbrush. If you really let a child go, the child may draw circles, squares, triangles, or abstract, totally dots or anything. There's no limitation on that. And I think that can be done, I know it can be done electronically, and I suspect it can be done many ways. For instance, I'll give you a good example of a non-electronic way it can be done. Give a child a symphony orchestra and let the child tell the oboe player, not play anything, but tell the oboe player to play this note. And then you tell someone else, the child can, 4.5-year-old child, leading an orchestra, telling them what to do. And the conductor, maybe. Beat your hand up and down and tell them to follow it and see what happens. Let them experiment with sophisticated materials. Because a paintbrush and paint and a canvas are very sophisticated materials compared in terms of the 3 primary colors is all you need to make all the colors. And but that's not true with what we do with children in music. Even a piano doesn't come close to what a paintbrush can do in terms of visuals. And I wouldn't think that if we give children's concerts, I wouldn't think, actually, and it sounds funny, but I wouldn't think that a symphony orchestra couldn't give up. I would think they could give up one morning a week to a group of children, maybe 5 kids, 10 kids, just as an experiment for a couple of months to see what a child might do if he had the whole palette of a symphony orchestra at his disposal.
It seems to me the biggest problem here is that we seem to have preconceived ideas of what is good. And therefore, a child, and we kind of set these up as a standard, and then we say, no, that's not good, and as a result, we intimidate children from making any choices at all.
Yeah, well, we don't need to treat it as music. I mean, we don't need to treat the early training as musical studies any more than we treat the easel as learning to draw. They're creative expression of one sort or another, and one is with the eye and the other was the ear, and it wouldn't have to take the place, and shouldn't take the place of music lessons or any other kind of judgments you want to lay on the kid. Is up to you or anyone else to lay on them. I'm not even suggesting we don't give them judgments. I don't know that that's not necessary too. I'm just saying that in terms of creativity, the child has been limited to words and visual expression and has not had a chance at auditory of sound, sophisticated sound manipulations.
Since a lot of your music has employed movement, would you suggest perhaps coupled with this a freedom to move as well as creation of these sounds and choices?
I think that definitely, yeah, I left movement. I think definitely movement is also an area of creative choice. One important thing, though, is that there is in painting the physical thing, and in movement a physical thing. In writing, say a child beginning to write, a little older maybe, 4.5, but writing little poems and things like that, using words in an imaginative way, there is no physical reaction. And when you get to music, the composing of music is practically totally non-physical. And by being non-physical, it removes you from it. And that abstract experience, I mean, if we really think of what children miss most as they grow up, it's the ability to think abstractly. That's one of the things. We've assumed that it has to do with growing up, that the older you get, the more abstract you can think. I happen to believe that it has to do with the fact that all activities are directed toward the body with a child, and if it were ever removed from that, but given sophisticated materials to work with, that children have the capability of instantaneous spontaneous abstract thinking. I mean, it's just a theory.
In other words,
I don't know,
intuitively.
Yeah, I think that they can put things together abstractly. Not our logical abstraction, but we've never given them a chance because they've never had sophisticated things out there to manipulate. We don't let them manipulate us, cities, anything, you know. And a symphony orchestra, compared to a city, is relatively cheap. And I think that it's an important area to deal with. So it doesn't have to be dealt with in terms of music. I think it has to do with abstract creativity, which composition really is.
I have an article that I hand out to all my students. It's called Product versus Process. And probably what you're saying is that we're all hung up on product, and we don't really explore the processes enough. In other words, you know, if this isn't an end product, it has no value.
Yeah, it's a kind of time of experimentation and play, which is why I call those pieces play. It's a play can be an end in itself. It always was when we were kids. And if it happens to produce something at the other end, it happens always to produce on the other end. It produced us at the other end. I think we could spend more time just letting play be its own end, and something else may or may not come from it.
Is there anything in particular in music that you don't like?
Is there anything in music I don't
yes.
like? Yes. A lot of things I don't like.
Well, I mean, other than bad music, maybe,
well,
but what is that? Because you use about every sound that in the last couple of days I've heard quite a few sounds.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any... I generally don't like electronic music. That is, electronic music which sounds like the kind which you're used to hearing on commercials, and you know, the whip, 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 that kind of stuff. But even that has to be tempered. I think it depends on the way. I'd rather answer it the other way around, of what I like.
What do you like?
Yeah. I like things which, first of all, which seem fresh and somehow challenging and exciting, and it doesn't. This all has to do with the way things are put together, and.
Well, so many people ridicule certain styles. You know, I mean, they say, like rock. You know, a lot of people think rock is evil, and it's pertains to man's most baser emotions. You know, and they say, well, it's.
Well, I think that it's fine to get down to the nitty-gritty of emotions. I happen to have a dislike for, or an apprehension, let's say, about. Not necessarily rock, but popular music in our particular time, because I can't help but associate it with the sale of clothing, automobiles, outboard motors, barber shops, or the lack of. I just have the feeling that popular music, as we know it, is part of a rather strange consumer product
Sort of
orientation.
materialistic.
Yeah, and taking advantage of people at that rather basic level. I mean, this is a kind of propagandistic approach, which I find sometimes difficult. I have certain apprehensions about.
Morton, I wonder if you've followed jazz much throughout your life. Many jazz musicians today are involved in using electronics in their music. How sophisticated, I really don't know, but I wondered if you've been in contact with any of that and what your reactions may be.
Well, if you're talking about people like Miles Davis and that branch of jazz, I don't know too many are using electronics. I mean, they may be. I haven't kept up, and in listening, I haven't noticed the jazz. The electronics I've heard have been more in the rock jazz groups, or what you call that kind of half-breed now. But of the traditional avant-garde jazz, if there is such a thing, people, Coltrane and that whole field, I didn't know they were using electronics. So I'm not up on it, obviously.
When you use the term electronics in music, I think a lot of people think that anything that you push and makes a sound through electricity might be related to electronics. Where do you start defining so-called classical electronic music?
Yeah. Well, I would certainly start with a major, some kind of obvious modification of the instrument until it gets to, if it's just amplifying it, until one of the basic parameters of the sound is actually modified appreciably. I wouldn't have thought of it as electronics. I mean, amplification through a megaphone is just changing over to electronics in terms of simple amplification, and that's been done for a long time. So I would say that at least it would have to have a modification of the sound so that the sound is no longer recognizable before you would start saying they are really using electronics in some way.
A lot of those jazz composers are making use of ring modulators and high and low band pass filters, but with a traditional instrument, using, say, guitar, electric guitar, and feeding those sounds. So, in fact, I think one of the major scores, Shaft, made quite a bit of use of some of these modifiers.
I think we're not defining jazz the same way.
Right.
That's what the problem is. The groups that use traditional rock instrumentation. See, when I was listening to jazz, there wasn't such a thing as the electric guitar. So, I mean, there was an electric guitar, but it wasn't the whole electric instrument bag. So when I hear a group which is essentially electric, usually that has some rock orientation to me. I may be wrong about that, but I don't never think of that as jazz. I know they consider themselves, and other people do, to be jazz.
And I was thinking in terms of the Don Ellis Orchestra, who
Oh,
plays
yeah,
a
now
trumpet.
that's
and
an
he runs it,
example
and
of
you would never
definite-
know it was a trumpet.
That's
when you
right.
Hear
That's
the end result.
certainly an example of. Well, I would say that that whole area is definitely rather sophisticated in terms of its usage, and Joe Bird did that too. I forgot about the big band, and probably if Stan Kenton had started later, would be involved in that also, because he was certainly involved in sound and sound tone colors and
You know, we have some information that you were the founder of the San Francisco Tape Center. You going to tell us something about that center and what its purpose was and what it's doing now, if it's...
it's still going. This was actually started, became known as the San Francisco Tape Music Center Incorporated around 61. We started around 1958, a couple of us, putting together a studio. Several I had found several other people in those early days when we were first getting started who also had equipment, and we pooled the equipment and tried to get some money from wealthy people who were patrons and patronesses of the arts, and they informed us that we'd have to be non-profit in order for them to contribute, because that way they could deduct it. And we did get, it cost us $125 to incorporate in 1961, and the woman who had suggested we do that gave us a donation of $25. So, but anyway, it was dedicated by 1961 we were already giving about 10, 12 concerts a season, and composers, artists, filmmakers, poets, dancers. In fact, a lot of people got started at the Tape Center from the West Coast, doing their most. That was a place where they could try out their most avant-garde ideas. The San Francisco Meme Troupe, Ronnie Davis's Meme Troupe, which you may have heard of, it travels all over now, did his first really avant-garde activity there, a nude meme thing, which couldn't be done anywhere else, and things like that. It was a sort of central focal point for avant-garde arts of all sorts, and we were experimenting a lot with lights and various things, and the Fillmore West grew out of the Tape Center. The whole, in fact, the Trips Festival, which started the whole discotheque movement in the United States, multimedia discotheque, with rock and so forth, out of which came Fillmore West, and then the Electric Circus and Fillmore East, and all those also came out of the Tape Center, because the technology and the young people were coming around and learning how to do light shows and the whole thing. So by '64, I guess it was that thing was already, that whole popular side of it was already taking hold, and I left, I think it was '65, right after we got a $200,000 grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to move it to Mills College and give it a permanent housing. And the idea of permanence didn't appeal to me, so I left. And but it's still going there.
You spoke about the use of the tape and records briefly yesterday as a medium. How do you feel about the continuing potential of that, and particularly where quadrasonic sound and perhaps the use of a panoramic potentiometer and so forth with the kind of music you've been doing?
Well, I think that quadraphonic or quadrasonic, whatever they're calling it now, is going to make new music for that medium even more viable than even with stereo. And I think it's going to become, it may not catch on in the sense of millions of people interested in it, but I think the audience for new music will probably double and triple, especially as composers begin to think in terms of the quadraphonic record as the end, that not a performance, but a record as the end. Not to replace performance, but simply as another thing you can write for. You write for string quartet, orchestra, and record. The record is a medium. You might even use traditional instruments, but in a recording situation, use them like rock bands have been doing for a long time now. I remember talking to Jerry Wexler from Atlantic Records one day, and we were talking, and he just got a phone call. He said, well, we had to get rid of the guitar track. He said, we just sent the tape over to Memphis or someplace, and they're going to put on a guitar track down there. And the record came out, and it was one of the popular records, and you think of them all sitting there playing, and they just recording techniques are putting those things together. And I think serious composers can start thinking now in terms of recording techniques and records as a medium. I think it's very exciting.
Like musique concrète.
Well, maybe not even musique concrète, but for instance, balancing a harpsichord, using a harpsichord. I mean, it's taboo to use a harpsichord and amplify it, but if you, because in a live performance it would never work, right? But in a recording, there's no reason why you couldn't balance a harpsichord with a trombone and write a piece for that combination of instruments. It's a piece that could only be done with recording, and you could move the sound around the room. The sound could be spatially located without even any transformation of the sound itself. Just space and balance seems to me justification enough. It would be a kind of experience that could not be had any other way except on the record.
Was partly that idea used with your game room?
Game room was no. The game room was moving away from the record toward.
With the spatial relationship of the music. No.
Well, which game? There's one written up where a girl turns her hand around and moves the sound. Is that the one you're talking about?
This was one I was thinking.
Yeah, that's a possibility. That was different. That wasn't the same game room I was going to bring here, but and it's not the same as the record thing I'm talking about. However, it would be possible to invent several media, to bring several mediums together: television, records, tapes, films, the various home medium that exists now, and by having such devices like the kind that would allow you to move your hand and move sound through the room, to having several devices and scoring possibilities like on a Monopoly game or something, you know, where you could actually put this together. Several people in the room could literally compose all of these things, which might be pre-packaged as raw material, or people could make their own raw material and put them together. I think that comes close to the thing I was talking about earlier about experimenting, and children could do these things, you see.
I read several years ago where in San Francisco they had a total community experience where people used their house lights and automobile lights and their telephones and radios and horns, and on a certain time, on a certain evening, they were all going to respond to each other from one hill to the other hill. It seems like this is a very large extension of the same kind of thing.
I don't know that. We did in San Francisco, 63 or 4, we did a piece called Cityscape, which was a piece with a score, which dealt with several aspects of the city. There were automobiles involved, and they used their headlights in various ways and horns. And then we had various things on hills. It may have been the thing you were referring to. And we transported people in buses to various places, and people were moving around, watching from different hills, different parts of the show. Was called.
Well, Martin, it's been delightful talking with you, and I'm sorry, but we're going to have to call it quits to it because you have a lecture to give in a few minutes in another part of the campus. So we want to thank Mr. Martin Sobotnik for joining us today, and my other guests.